White Space by J.S. Watts. The cat was crying again. It wanted fuss and attention, or food, or all three, but it was out of luck. Terry was otherwise engaged. The cat stopped crying. Presumably it had now starved to death, left home in search of more hospitable climes, or was contentedly gnawing its way through the contents of the larder, just for the hell of it, or in the hope of finding something vaguely edible. Terry, however, was still otherwise engaged. Terry had been otherwise engaged for some months now. If she thought about it, which she had done, frequently, incessantly, obsessively, and unproductively, the problem had begun back in the late spring, when she had grown bored with sitting in her study all day just writing. The world was out there, getting warmer, increasingly vibrant, and more inviting by the minute, readying itself for summer, and she had wanted her fair share of it. The trouble with Terry, though, was that she was an all-or-nothing girl. Her idea of fair share was all day, every day, and goodbye to any time spent writing indoors, or writing anywhere, come to that. A more balanced approach, some time spent writing indoors, some time spent enjoying outdoors, some time spent enjoying writing outdoors, would have been more productive in terms of both creativity and income. But Terry despised the drab mediocrity of a balanced approach. As a result, whenever her mother or friends rang to see how she was and how the writing was coming along, she'd pleaded writer's block and justified her days of outdoor frivolity and consumer indulgence as necessary cerebral stimulation, rather than the instant self-gratification they actually were. If truth be told, the writing had been flowing very smoothly prior to Terry's alfresco extravaganza. She was ahead of schedule, and so, as far as Terry was concerned, was in the money and had done the business. There was no harm in turning off the tap for a while, and until she'd had her fill of mindless distractions. Eventually, the demands of earning a living and paying off her credit cards, plus a growing boredom with largely purposeless activity and the monotony of endless fun, enticed Terry back into writing mode. She excused her previous excesses by promising herself she would be just as excessive with her writing as she had been with her fun time, and would more than compensate for her earlier lack of self-restraint and the resultant absence from her writing desk by embracing it 24/7, or as near as possible, given the necessity of sleeping, eating, and, of course, feeding the cat. Terry's future, however, was turning out not to be quite as she had foreseen it. The writer's block she had used and abused as an excuse for her extended jaunting decided it was payback time. When finally she returned to her desk, it was to find the words had genuinely stopped flowing, and her imagination had gone into indefinite, long-term hibernation. Over the next couple of months, Terry came to dread the morning ritual of going into her study, only to stare, for what seemed like forever, at a blank computer screen, or a blank sheet of paper, or the more alarming blankness that was lining the inside of her head. Eventually, she stopped going into her study and tried writing in other locations around the house. Wherever she chose to sit, or stand, or lie down, the effect was still the same, a huge snow wall of nothingness. The Inuit build snow walls as windbreaks, protection against the freezing external forces that threaten destruction. Terry's snow wall was an immovable force of destruction in its own right, and a solidly internal one. If solitude was proving to be bleak and lonelier because of the blankness within, then company and the external world offered no better alternative. The cat was no comfort. It just meowed. She dreaded phone calls and visits from work, friends and family because of the barricade of lies they necessitated regarding progress with her writing. Sure, she rationalised them away as white lies, because she was going to start writing soon, any day now, in fact. But her conscience felt the dragging truth of it. The promised stimulus of outside she had used to explain away and excuse her earlier lack of industry no longer existed for her. Outside was now as dull and depressing as inside, and came with added guilt, because she associated it with the unchecked pleasure consumption that had taken place prior to this enforced period of creative abstinence. Inside her head, the snow wall remained resolutely in place, and from its foundations flowed a great, wide, white desert of nothingness that steadily blanketed the whole of Terry's world. Snow waves and dunes extended as far as her mental eye could see, and because everything was white, Terry could not even ease the monotony by differentiating between these features. All there was white blankness, a total absence of anything, including perspective or the possibility of a horizon. As her days extended into the whiteness, Terry lost sight of hope within the vast wastes of purity. Domestic life paled into insignificance, and the cat was forced to shift for itself. It learned the hard way that crying was not going to get it anywhere, and the solution to its predicament lay within its own four paws. Terry was otherwise engaged. But then a random trawl through the white noise of the internet, when forcing herself to sit at her desk, led Terry to an unusual website that promised the solution to creative and psychic blockages of all types and guaranteed to restore the hues of her lost rainbow at a ridiculously reasonable price. Salvation was only a credit card click away, and Terry clicked with renewed vigour and consumer anticipation. Within 7 days, a small brown package was delivered to her door. Extracting it from the claws of the ever-hopeful cat, Terry eagerly unwrapped it to find an even smaller, dark green glass bottle that seemed to shimmer with all the colours of her promised rainbow, together with a disproportionately large white paper sheet of instructions. The bottle enticed with luminous New Age mystique and promises of the imagination. The crisply typed instructions did not. Terry was keen to abandon the boredom of monochrome as soon as possible and let the colour back into her life. The bottle was tiny. Why waste time reading the reams of black and white pedestrian instructions when there wasn't much of the supposed herbal remedy to take in the first place? All she had to do was consume it. She had lost more than enough time already. The bottle was opened, and the entire contents, of which, it must be said, there was not a lot, was tipped down Terry's throat. Terry gagged, but eventually managed to swallow. It certainly didn't taste very nice, but then medicine that actually worked never seemed to. So far, so good. Terry waited. She wasn't sure what she had expected to happen, but nothing at all appeared to. She didn't feel any different. The contents of her head were not in any way changed, and when she picked up a pen or sat down expectantly at her keyboard, nothing seemed to be different either. Her internalised snowscape remained uniformly bleak. Terry felt short-changed. That night, Terry sought solace in the numbing effects of alcohol, a lake of red wine to counterbalance the cold acres of white still blanketing her brain. Waking up the next morning, it felt as if builders had moved into her brain pan, but the drills and hammers were worth it, as the clanging, banging, and concurrent, colourfully variegated vomiting was slowly but surely clearing away the white. Terry had an idea. It was her first independent idea for ages, and although it was relatively small and underdeveloped, it came with words already attached. Terry picked up a pen and started to write. The words began to flow, and by the end of the session, Terry had a complete short story. The headache clung on for the rest of the day, but it was worth it. She was writing again. The headache was still there the following day, but what did Terry care? She had a second short story already forming in her head, and the beginnings of a poem. The black keys on Terry's keyboard clicked and rattled away. Terry treated herself to a bright red manicure to celebrate. By day 3, Terry felt the need to make notes of the poems and stories shaping and reshaping themselves in her head. There wasn't time to write them all up, but if she worked up some and kept notes of the others, she would create a reservoir of imagination she could dip into at will when the current gush of ideas had slowed down a bit. In the meantime, she was working frantically to complete the stories and poems whose pigments most heavily stained her conscious mind. She was also swallowing regular doses of aspirin. Come day 4, the stories and poems had multiplied and extended to include ideas for 2 vibrant children's books, at least 1 novel, and several factual but entertaining articles. Her ideas list was getting longer by the hour, and she was finding it more and more difficult to keep up with the primary tone thoughts demanding instant gratification and completion. Her consumption of painkillers was tightrope walking along the recommended dosage level. Day 7, and Terry's head was a kaleidoscope of ever-shifting, child and hallucinogenic drug-friendly colour. She had written solidly for as much time as she could physically manage, and was surrounded by manuscripts and a huge white sea of pages from her future's ideas list. But, to her eyes, the pages appeared to pulse with words of painfully clashing colours, and the ideas just kept on coming. Her head felt like it was about to crack open. She was sleeping very little, but when she did manage to get some shut-eye, there was no escape. What little sleep she achieved was filled with vivid dreams, and the dreams were full of stories and images and random lines of poetry and voices, so many voices, declaiming from works she had yet to write. Each time exhaustion forced her to shut her eyes, the voices grew louder. Each time she woke up, the ideas in her head became more insistent. Her pale eyes grew alarmingly bloodshot. She had no time for anything but writing, yet there wasn't enough time to release the ideas swarming in her head by jotting down even a few notes. The reserve pool filled and overflowed. The already deep, dark waters carried on rising, and Terry was drowning in her own imagination. There was no way she could come up for air. There was no longer any up. In the end, it was the cat that saved her, or came as near to saving her as was possible. Having exhausted both the play and food potential of the kitchen cupboards, and having grown hungrier than was acceptable to feline self-respect, it took to crying at the neighbour's back door. Fortunately, the neighbours not only fed the cat, but thought to wonder what might be preventing Terry from feeding her usually overindulged pet. It was they who found her, curled up in a ball and whimpering, in the midst of a study flooded with sheets of plain white paper. Eventually, after kind words and sympathy failed to elicit a response, they called for an ambulance. When, significantly later, it became obvious that Terry would not be coming home from hospital for some considerable time, they took the cat in on a permanent basis, and even augmented the occasional uncomfortable visits of Terry's family and friends by popping into hospital to see her from time to time. If they were distressed by the sight of her in her empty and clinically white single-occupant room, clinging with desperation to what little peace was offered by starched white hospital sheets and a white hospital gown, they soon learned not to show it. In much the same way, they learned not to bring her any gifts unless they too were as white and uncontaminated with colour as the newly fallen snow.
J.S. Watts is a British writer. Her poetry, short stories, and book reviews appear in a wide variety of publications in Britain, Canada, Australia, and the States, and have been broadcast on BBC and independent radio. To date, she has published 3 books: Cats and Other Myths, a full poetry collection, and Songs of Steelyard Sue, a multi-award-nominated poetry pamphlet, are both published by Lapwing Publications. A dark fiction novel, A Darker Moon, is published in the UK and the US by Vagabondage Press. A second novel, in J.S.'s 4th book, Witchlight, is due out from Vagabondage Press in spring of 2015. For further details, see J.S.'s website, www.jswatts.co.uk.